The city of Brennan sat under a gray sky for 9 months of every year. Its streets were empty of decoration or warmth. The only thing that moved with purpose was the cold wind, cutting through the wool coats of workers who walked to the old meat packing plant on the edge of town. Curtis Webb was one of those workers. He had been at the plant for 14 years, never complaining or smiling much, and every morning he woke at 5, boiled water for a thermos, then walked 30 minutes through the frozen slush of Maple Street. The plant was a maze of concrete floors, steel beams, and rusted pipes that hissed steam in the winter. The smell of salt and old blood had soaked into every wall so deeply that new workers gagged for their first week. Curtis worked the brine room, a long cold chamber filled with huge rectangular tanks where meat was preserved in salt water. His job was simple: check the temperature gauges, monitor the salt levels, and once a week help drain and clean one of the tanks. It was mindless work, but Curtis preferred it that way. Mindless work left his mind free to think about nothing at all, a survival tactic he had learned after his wife left him 6 years ago without a word. On a Tuesday in late February, the foreman told Curtis to drain tank number 4. This tank had not been cleaned in 6 months because of a broken drain valve that had finally been fixed. Curtis put on his rubber boots and thick gloves, then climbed the metal ladder to the top of the tank. The brine had already been pumped out the night before, leaving only a thin layer of salt crust on the bottom and a dark sludge in the corners. Curtis lowered himself into the tank with a plastic scraper and a bucket. The air inside was heavy and cold enough to make his knuckles ache. He started scraping the north wall when his scraper hit something that was not metal and not salt. It made a soft thud, like wood hitting wood. Curtis knelt down and pushed the sludge aside with his glove. A leather folder appeared, dark brown and the size of a small book. Its surface was stiff and cracked from months underwater. He pulled it out, wiped the salt off with his sleeve, and opened it carefully. Inside there were 3 folded papers and a photograph. The papers were pay stubs showing workers' names and amounts of money too high for the hours listed. The names were Robert Hayes, Peter Dunn, and Frank Lohman. Curtis recognized 2 of those names. Robert Hayes had worked in the loading dock 2 years ago before suddenly leaving Brennan one winter. People said he moved south. Peter Dunn had worked on the kill floor and vanished a year after Robert. The company said he quit. Frank Lohman had been on Curtis's own shift. He disappeared 8 months ago, and his locker was cleaned out by the supervisor himself. The photograph was torn unevenly, as if someone had ripped it in a hurry. What remained showed 3 men standing in front of tank number 4, smiling. One of them held a piece of paper that looked like the same pay stubs. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single word in black ink: Sutter. Curtis knew that name. Todd Sutter was the floor supervisor, a quiet man with a clean gray beard and eyes that never blinked enough. He had been at the plant for 20 years and was respected by everyone because he never yelled and never wrote anyone up without reason. But there was something else that Curtis remembered now. Todd Sutter had been the one to clean out Frank Lohman's locker. He had been the one to tell everyone that Frank moved away without telling anyone. That story had seemed odd at the time, but not odd enough to question. Curtis looked back at the pay stubs. If Robert, Peter, and Frank had discovered that Sutter was stealing from the company by inflating their pay stubs and pocketing the difference, then they would have had a reason to confront him. And if Sutter was the kind of man who solved problems with violence, then those 3 men did not move away at all. Curtis felt his chest tighten. He placed the folder inside his jacket, zipped it shut, and climbed out of the tank. He told the foreman that the cleaning would take another hour because the sludge was thick, a lie that the foreman accepted with a nod before walking away. Curtis sat on the metal catwalk above the Brine room and stared at the folder in his lap. He had no phone to take pictures, no computer to search for news, only his memory and his eyes. He thought about going to the police, but the police in Brennan were two old men who played cards with the plant managers on Fridays. They were useless for anything serious. He thought about telling another worker, but whispers traveled fast in a factory. If Sutter found out that someone had the folder, that someone would be the next person to vanish. Curtis decided to say nothing to anyone for now. He finished cleaning tank number 4, hid the folder inside an empty chemical drum behind the boiler room, and went home. That night he could not sleep. He lay in his small rented room on the second floor of a boarding house on Elm Street, listening to the wind rattle the window. He had no proof that Sutter had killed anyone, only 3 pay stubs that did not make sense, a torn photograph with Sutter's name on it, and a feeling in his bones that something terrible had happened in that plant. He decided to do something stupid. He would investigate on his own, not as a detective because he was just a worker, but as a man who could not let 3 dead men be forgotten. He would watch Todd Sutter, study the factory's routines, and find a way to expose the truth before the folder was discovered missing or destroyed. The next morning, Curtis arrived at the plant 30 minutes early. He stood by the time clock and watched the workers file in. Todd Sutter walked past him at exactly 6:15, just like every morning. He nodded at Curtis. Curtis nodded back. But for the first time, he noticed that Sutter's eyes did not blink enough. They were dry and still, like the eyes of a man who had looked at too many things he did not want to remember. Curtis clocked in and walked to the Brine room, but his mind was no longer on the tanks. It was on a torn photograph and 3 names that no one in Brennan talked about anymore. For 3 days, Curtis Webb did nothing but watch. He watched Todd Sutter from a distance, pretending to check valves and pressure gauges while his eyes followed the gray-bearded supervisor across the factory floor. He learned Sutter's patterns by heart. At 7:15, Sutter walked to the main office for a coffee break that lasted exactly 11 minutes. At 9:30, he inspected the loading dock. At 11, he walked the perimeter of the kill floor. At 1 in the afternoon, he disappeared into a small storage room behind the walk-in freezer for 20 minutes. No one knew what he did in there. Curtis found a way to walk past that storage room during those 20 minutes. The door was solid steel with a single padlock and no window, but the floor beneath the door had a small gap of less than an inch. On the second day, Curtis dropped a metal washer near the door and knelt to pick it up. He pressed his cheek to the cold concrete and looked under the gap. He saw Sutter's boots standing in front of a wooden crate. The crate was open, and inside it were stacks of paper and a heavy object wrapped in cloth. Curtis could not see more. He stood up and walked away before anyone noticed. That night, he wrote down everything he had seen in a small notebook he kept in his sock drawer. He also wrote down the names of every worker who had left the plant in the past 3 years. There were 12 names. 3 were the men from the folder. The other 9 had moved to other cities, or so everyone believed. Curtis started asking careful questions. During lunch break, he sat next to an old janitor named Oscar who had been at the plant for 30 years. Curtis asked about Robert Hayes without mentioning the folder. He said he was just wondering what happened to the man who used to help him lift the heavy barrels. Oscar said Robert was a good man. Then he looked around and whispered that Robert had been fired for stealing, but Oscar did not believe it. Robert was too honest, Oscar said. That was the problem. Curtis asked about Peter Dunn. Oscar said Peter was fired for fighting, but Curtis pointed out that Peter never fought with anyone. Oscar just shrugged and said that was what the paperwork said, then walked away to mop the floor. Curtis asked about Frank Lohman last. Oscar did not want to talk about Frank at all. He just shook his head and said Frank asked too many questions about the pay stubs. Then one day, Frank stopped showing up. Supervisor Todd Sutter said Frank quit and moved to the coast, but Frank's car was still in the parking lot for 3 weeks before someone towed it away. Curtis felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He went back to the Brine room and retrieved the leather folder from the chemical drum. He examined the pay stubs again in the dim light of a bare bulb. Each stub had a date. Robert Hayes' stub was from November 3 years ago. Peter Dunn's was from January 2 years ago. Frank Lohman's was from June last year. All 3 months before each man disappeared. The pattern was clear: they had discovered the fraud, and Sutter had silenced them. But where were the bodies? Curtis thought about the plant's basement level below the kill floor. It had been sealed off 20 years ago because of a structural crack. No one went down there anymore. The entrance was a metal hatch near the old boiler room, covered by a heavy pallet of salt bags. Curtis had walked past that hatch 1,000 times. He decided to move the pallet that night after his shift ended. At 6 in the evening, the plant went quiet. There was a 30-minute window of silence before the night shift arrived at 7. Curtis pushed the pallet of salt bags aside with all his strength. The metal hatch had a wheel lock that was rusted shut. Curtis wrapped his glove around the wheel and turned. It did not move. He found a crowbar in the tool shed and wedged it between the spokes. He leaned his full weight into the bar. The wheel groaned and turned a 1/4 inch, then another 1/4 inch. After 5 minutes of effort, the lock released. Curtis lifted the hatch. A wave of cold stale air rose from below. The smell was old metal, wet concrete, and something else, something sweet and rotten that had faded over time but never disappeared. Curtis pointed his flashlight into the darkness. A set of concrete stairs descended into a low-ceiling tunnel. He climbed down slowly. The walls were covered in white mineral stains, and the floor was wet with groundwater seepage. After walking for 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a small room. In the center of the room was a deep concrete pit. It had once been a drainage sump for the old slaughterhouse floor. Now it was empty except for a pile of broken pallets and rusted chains. But on the far wall of the pit, Curtis saw something that made him stop breathing. There were dark stains on the concrete in the shape of a human body slumped against the wall. The stains were old and brown, soaked into the porous surface like spilled coffee into a paper towel. Curtis aimed his flashlight at the floor near the stains. He saw a work boot, just one, a size 10 or 11, covered in dust but otherwise intact. The laces were still tied. Curtis did not climb into the pit. He did not need to. He knew that Sutter had brought the men down here, hurt them, and left them in the drainage sump. Then he had sealed the hatch and told everyone they had moved away. The bodies had been removed at some point, probably by Sutter himself, but the stains remained, the boot remained, and the truth remained. Curtis backed away from the pit. He climbed the stairs, closed the hatch, and pushed the pallet of salt bags back into place. His hands were shaking, and his mind was racing. He could not go to the police without physical evidence. The pay stubs and photograph were not enough. The stains and the boot were locked behind a hatch that Sutter would deny ever knowing about. Curtis needed a plan. He needed to make Sutter expose himself without using weapons or violence. He thought about the storage room where Sutter disappeared every afternoon at 1 o'clock. That room held a wooden crate with papers and a wrapped object. If Curtis could get into that room and take something, he would have proof. But the padlock was strong, and Sutter kept the only key. That night, Curtis sat on his bed in the boarding house and stared at the ceiling. He remembered something from the folder. There was a delivery schedule written on the back of one of the pay stubs. The schedule showed that the cleaning crew for the brine tanks came once every 6 months. Tank number 4 had just been cleaned, meaning the folder had been hidden there for 6 months and would be safe for another 6 months. But Sutter would eventually notice it was missing if he ever went looking for it. Curtis had to act fast. He decided to set a trap using the factory's own machinery. He knew the brine room had a secondary drain pipe that connected to the main sewer line outside the plant. That pipe was wide enough for a thin man to crawl through. Curtis was thin from years of skipping meals to save money. He measured the pipe opening behind tank number 3. It was 18 inches wide. He could fit. The pipe led to a manhole cover in the alley behind the plant. If Sutter chased him into the brine room, Curtis could escape through the pipe and lead Sutter out into the open where other workers would see him. But first, he needed to lure Sutter to the brine room and make him confess. He would leave the leather folder on top of tank number 4 with a note inside. The note would say, "I know what you did to Robert, Peter, and Frank. Sign your name on this paper if you want it back." Then Curtis would hide behind the tank and wait. When Sutter came, he would see the folder, panic, and write his name. That signature on the paper would be proof. It was risky and desperate, but it was the only plan Curtis had. Curtis Webb put his plan into motion on a Friday, the day before the weekend when the plant would be mostly empty. He arrived at work 3 hours before his shift started, using a key he had copied from the janitor's office on the pretense of needing to fix a leak. The factory was dark and silent. His footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as he went to the brine room. He placed the leather folder on top of tank number 4, exactly in the center where anyone climbing the ladder would see it immediately. Inside the folder, he inserted a blank piece of paper torn from his notebook. On top of that paper, he placed a note written in block letters. The note said, "Todd Sutter, I have the pay stubs and the photograph. I will give them to the police unless you come to tank 4 today at 1 o'clock and sign your name on the paper below. Sign it and you can have the folder back. Do not bring anyone." Curtis knew Sutter would not be able to resist. The folder was the only physical evidence linking him to the missing men. Sutter would come to the brine room to retrieve it, but instead of signing, he would probably try to destroy the folder and search for whoever left it. That was why Curtis would be hiding behind tank number 3, near the drain pipe opening. He had removed the grate covering the pipe the night before and hidden it behind a barrel of salt. The pipe was dark and cold but wide enough. He had also wedged a long steel rod inside the pipe, placed so that he could pull it out and use it to brace the manhole cover open from below. The alley outside had a streetlight that flickered. At 12:15, Curtis hid behind tank number 3 and waited. The minutes crawled past. He heard the distant sounds of machinery starting up as the day shift began. He heard footsteps in the hallway outside the brine room, but they were other workers going to their stations. No one came into the brine room except a young man who checked the temperature gauges and left. Then the morning faded into afternoon. At exactly 1 o'clock, Curtis heard a different set of footsteps, slow and deliberate. The door to the brine room opened with a soft creak. Todd Sutter walked in alone. He wore his usual gray coveralls and steel-toed boots. His gray beard was trimmed neatly, and his eyes scanned the room slowly before landing on the leather folder on top of tank number 4. He walked to the ladder and climbed up without making a sound. He picked up the folder and opened it. He read the note. Curtis watched from behind tank number 3, holding his breath. But Sutter did not sign the paper. Instead, he folded the note and put it in his pocket. Then he took the leather folder under his arm and climbed back down. He stood in the middle of the Brine room and spoke in a low, calm voice. He said he knew someone was in there because the note said 1 o'clock, and whoever left the folder would not leave it unless they were watching to make sure he came alone. He told the hidden person to come out. Curtis did not move. After 10 seconds, Sutter said the hidden person had 3 choices: come out and talk like a man, stay hidden and be found before the end of the day, or run and be reported to the police for stealing company property, losing their job. Curtis knew Sutter was bluffing about the police, but he also knew that Sutter was not bluffing about searching the room. The Brine room had only a few hiding places, and behind tank number 3 was the most obvious. Sutter would check there within a minute. Curtis made a decision. He stepped out from behind the tank. Sutter looked at him and tilted his head. He said, "Curtis Webb, I should have guessed. You have always been the quiet type, the type who watches." He asked what Curtis had found in the folder. Curtis said nothing, just stared at Sutter without speaking. Sutter smiled a thin, dry smile. He said that talking gets people killed, then demanded the rest of the evidence because the pay stubs and photograph were not all that Curtis had found. Curtis shook his head. Sutter took 1 step forward. Curtis took 1 step back. He was now standing directly next to the drain pipe opening. Sutter saw the opening and realized what Curtis was planning. He lunged. Curtis dropped to his knees and slid into the pipe feet first. He pushed himself backward into the darkness. The pipe was tight around his shoulders. He used his elbows to pull himself along the cold, wet metal. Behind him, he heard Sutter curse, then heard the man's boots scrape against the pipe entrance. Sutter was trying to follow. Curtis pushed faster. The pipe sloped downward slightly, carrying him toward the alley. He could see a faint circle of light ahead where the pipe ended at the manhole. He reached the end and pushed the steel cover upward. It was heavy, but it moved. He scrambled out into the alley on his hands and knees. The street light above him flickered. He grabbed the steel rod he had hidden inside the pipe and pulled it out. Then he wedged it between the manhole cover and the concrete rim so that the cover could not be pushed open from below. Sutter's voice echoed up from the pipe, muffled and shouting, but the words were unclear. Curtis stood up. His coveralls were soaked with freezing water, and his hands were bleeding from scraping against the pipe walls. He walked to the front of the plant where the day shift workers were walking to the parking lot for the end of their shift. He found the foreman standing by the time clock. He told the foreman that Todd Sutter was trapped in the drain pipe behind the Brine room and that the police needed to be called. He handed the foreman the pay stubs and the photograph from his jacket pocket. He explained that Sutter had been stealing from the company and had murdered 3 workers who discovered the theft. The foreman looked at the evidence, then at Curtis's bleeding hands. He walked to the office phone and called the police. The 2 old policemen arrived 20 minutes later. They pulled Sutter out of the drain pipe by his ankles. He was covered in sludge and screaming about liars and framed workers. But the pay stubs were real. His signature on the safety inspection forms for the sealed basement was real too, once the police opened the hatch and found the bloodstains and the work boot. They arrested Todd Sutter that evening. He was charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of fraud. The trial took place 3 months later in the county courthouse. Curtis testified about finding the folder in the brine tank. Oscar the janitor testified about the missing men. The forensic team confirmed that the blood stains in the basement matched Robert Hayes and Peter Dunn. Frank Lohman's remains were never found, but the boot had his name written inside the tongue. Todd Sutter was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Curtis Webb kept his job at the plant. He was given a small bonus by the company for honesty, which he used to buy a new winter coat. He still walked to work every morning at 5. He still checked the temperature gauges in the brine room. But he no longer felt invisible. The other workers nodded at him differently now. They saw him as the man who had done something, the man who had crawled through a drain pipe to escape a killer, the man who had brought a murderer to justice without a weapon, without a badge, and without saying a single word. Brennan remained a cold gray city, and the plant still smelled of salt and old blood. But every time Curtis walked past tank number 4, he remembered the 3 men who had not been forgotten. He had given them back their names, and that was enough.